It is 7:30 in the evening on January 5th, 1942, and inside the Gothic hulk of Colditz Castle, a play is about to begin. Prisoners shuffle into the theater in the camp attic, coughing in the cold, settling onto rows of borrowed chairs beneath a low-beamed ceiling. Nobody in the audience is watching the stage. Their eyes keep drifting to a trapdoor near the footlights, the one used to store scenery, the one that leads, if you know where to dig, into an empty attic space above the guardhouse itself. Two men are not in their seats. Lieutenant Arie Neve and Dutch officer Tony Lutane have slipped away in the confusion of the crowd, and in a freezing storeroom above the German command block they are dressing, quite calmly, as officers of the Wehrmacht. The tunics are homemade, cut from Dutch army greatcoats and dyed field gray. The buttons have been cast from melted-down silver paper and lead. The belts are painted linoleum. Under the bare bulb, in the half-dark, the uniforms will not survive close inspection. They do not need to. They need to survive 100 meters of open ground, past sentries trained to salute a uniform before they question a face. Neve has done this before. 4 months earlier, he tried the same trick with a uniform hacked from a Polish army tunic and a cap colored with stolen scenery paint. And the prison searchlights turned the whole ensemble a lurid, unmistakable green. A German officer laughed and said he should be sent to the Russian front as punishment for the insult. This time the tailoring is better, and so is the plan. Neve speaks fluent German. He has studied the mannerisms of the guards for months, the particular way they hold a swagger stick, the clipped rhythm of their commands. Tonight, he is not really escaping from Colditz. He is walking out of its front gate in daylight uniform, past men trained their whole careers to stop prisoners, by becoming, for exactly as long as it takes to cross a moat and a wall, one of the men guarding him. This is the story of how a prisoner of the most secure castle in the Third Reich turned the enemy's own uniform into the one disguise nobody thought to search for, and in doing so exposed a truth the Germans never quite came to terms with, that the most sophisticated fortress in their prison system could be defeated not by dynamite or by cunning tunnels alone, but by tailoring, nerve, and the simple, audacious act of impersonation. Colditz existed because every other prison in the German system had failed to hold its most determined men. By the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht had a growing problem it had not anticipated at the start of the war. Officers who would not stop trying to escape. Ordinary camps relied on wire, distance, and the exhaustion of captivity to wear men down. It did not work on everyone. A hard core of British, French, Dutch, Polish, and Belgian officers kept tunneling, kept vaulting fences, kept vanishing from roll calls, and every time one did, German security officials removed him to somewhere harder. Eventually, those men accumulated in a single fortress above the river Mulde, 25 miles south of Leipzig, a castle first built in the 12th century and repurposed as an asylum, a sanatorium, and finally, from 1939, as Oflag 4C, the place the Germans sent prisoners they considered incorrigible. On paper, Colditz was the answer to the escaping problem. It sat on a rock outcrop above a 100-foot drop to the river. There was no tunneling through solid stone without enormous effort, and sound detectors were installed to catch anyone who tried. A dry moat, a high outer wall, barbed wire, armed sentries on fixed patrols, and searchlights burning through the night surrounded a building with perhaps only a handful of viable exits. The Germans believed with some justification that the castle was escape-proof. Roughly 800 prisoners were held there at its peak, drawn from half a dozen nations, all of them selected precisely because ordinary security had already failed to contain them once. Neve himself was a case study in that failure. Captured wounded at Calais in May 1940 during the desperate rearguard fighting that bought time for the Dunkirk evacuation, he passed through 2 earlier camps before Colditz, escaping briefly from a camp near Thorn in occupied Poland in April 1941, only to be recaptured close to the Soviet-controlled border and handed over, for a frightening spell, to the Gestapo. By the time he arrived at Colditz that May, aged 25, He had already demonstrated exactly the trait the castle was designed to contain. He simply would not accept that captivity was permanent. Life inside the walls did nothing to discourage that instinct. Days at Colditz were long, cold, and repetitive, filled with roll calls and little else, and for men like Neve, the tedium itself became a kind of engine, driving them to spend every spare hour studying guard rotations, sketching floor plans, and turning boredom into the raw material of escape. The scale of the challenge should not be understated. By 1941, the German garrison at Colditz had seen every trick in the standard escapers' repertoire and had adjusted accordingly. Forged papers were checked against known formats. Civilian disguises were compared against a growing catalog of previous attempts, some of which the Germans had even photographed and put on display in a small museum of their own, a wry trophy cabinet of failed prisoner ingenuity. Ordinary sentries had grown practiced at spotting the particular hesitancy of a man impersonating a trade he did not know, whether an electrician, a delivery driver, or a Red Cross official. Tunneling, the default method elsewhere in the German camp system, was all but foreclosed by the castle's solid rock foundations and its sound detection equipment. Every conventional avenue narrowed a little further with each passing month, and the Germans, not unreasonably, believed they had closed the net. What they had not fully accounted for was a body of officers with the time, the tools, and the collective ingenuity to manufacture an entirely new kind of disguise. Not a workman's overalls, but the uniform of the enemy himself. What the German command had not fully reckoned with was what happens when you concentrate several hundred of the most inventive, stubborn, and bored men in Europe inside one building and give them 18 months with nothing else to do. Existing methods of escape, the tunnel, the wire cutters, the disguise as a workman or a Red Cross official, had all been tried and largely defeated at Colditz precisely because the terrain and the guards were built to expect them. Michael Sinclair, one of the camp's most persistent escapers, would later be shot and killed attempting a variation on an old French trick, dressing as a German sergeant major to walk prisoners out under a false work detail. The garrison had grown practiced at spotting forged papers, at recognizing the wrong cut of a civilian jacket, at catching the telltale hesitation of a man who does not know where the ordinary German worker keeps his identity card. Every obvious route was watched. The problem, for Neve and men like him, was not merely getting past the walls, it was finding the one disguise so bold that nobody thought to look for it, not a workman sneaking past the guards, but a guard walking out through his own front gate. The plan that finally worked at Colditz was designed less by any single engineer than by the camp's own escape committee, an unofficial but highly organized body of British officers who vetted, funded, and approved attempts the way a general staff might approve an operation. Pat Reed, the British escape officer, coordinated the effort behind Neve and Lutein's bid, and the technical work fell to whichever prisoners had a trade that could be repurposed. A tailor's eye, a theater designer's skill with paint and papier-mâché, a man who had once worked with metal. Colditz held its own miniature war economy of forgery and manufacture, hidden in ceiling spaces and false-bottomed boxes, and by the winter of 1941 it had produced something close to a costume workshop capable of turning Allied battle dress into a passable German uniform. The uniforms Neve and Lutein wore on January 5th were built from Dutch Army greatcoats, chosen because the gray-green wool was close enough to Wehrmacht field gray once dyed, and cut down by prisoners with tailoring experience into something resembling an officer's tunic. The insignia, buttons, and badges of rank were cast from silver paper and scavenged metal, melted over an improvised flame and poured into carved wooden or plaster molds. A process not unlike a jeweler casting a ring, only conducted in secret between roll calls. Belts and holsters were made from linoleum tiles prized up from the floor and painted black, stiff enough at a distance to pass as leather, useless if anyone got close enough to touch them. Caps were built from cardboard and cloth, their peaks stiffened and darkened with paint smuggled in from the camp's own theatrical stores, the same stores that had betrayed Neve's first attempt when the searchlights turned his badly mixed green paint the color of a traffic light rather than field gray. The route out was as carefully engineered as the costumes. Rather than attempt to bluff their way past the main gate directly from the prisoners' courtyard, Neve and Lutain used the camp theater itself, built directly above the German guardhouse, as their staging point. A hole had been cut and disguised beneath the stage, giving access down into an unused loft above the guards' own quarters, a space so close to the enemy that the escapers could hear German conversation through the floorboards while they changed. From there, a route led down into a corridor used by German personnel, and out through a door into the dry moat that ordinary prisoners could never approach. The genius of the plan was not the uniform alone. It was walking out through the one door in the castle that nobody expected a prisoner to use, dressed as the very men who controlled it. Once beyond the moat, Neve and Lutain discarded their German tunics to reveal civilian suits underneath, tailored from more smuggled and altered cloth, and became, in the space of a few minutes, ordinary travelers rather than escaped prisoners or disguised soldiers. Exactly how many such uniforms were produced inside Colditz across the war is not fully recorded. The camp's escape committee kept records that were, by necessity, destroyed or hidden rather than filed for posterity, and much of what survives comes from post-war memoirs and MI9 debriefing reports rather than contemporaneous inventories. What is documented is that German uniform disguise became one of the castle's recurring techniques, attempted with varying success by several nationalities throughout the war, evidence that the workshop behind Neve's uniform was not a single stroke of luck, but a repeatable capability the prisoners had built for themselves. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a great deal more of this story still to come. Neve and Lutain's walk through the gate on the night of January 5, 1942, remains the best documented use of the German officer disguise at Colditz, precisely because it succeeded and its authors survived to describe it. Neve, fluent in German and coached for months in the bearing of an officer, returned the salutes of real sentries as the pair crossed the moat and the outer wall in the dark, the two of them walking, by his own later account, with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of men who belonged there. Once clear of the castle grounds, they shed the military tunics for civilian dress and split from any further reliance on disguise, traveling by train and on foot through Leipzig and Ulm, following an escape route towards Switzerland that had been pioneered by a Dutch escaper named Hans Larive. 5 days after leaving Colditz, they crossed into neutral Switzerland near Singen, becoming the first Allied officers to make a complete home run from a camp the Germans had publicly declared inescapable. The psychological effect inside Colditz was immediate and, by several accounts, considerable. A camp designed explicitly to be the end of the line, the place incorrigible escapers were sent precisely so they could escape no further, had just proven porous. German records of the period show a marked tightening of guard rotations and gate procedures in the weeks that followed, and further uniform-based attempts by other nationalities met sharper scrutiny as a result. Not every subsequent attempt using the same basic method succeeded. The tightened security that followed Neve's escape contributed to the failure, and, in at least one later case, the death of prisoners who tried variations on impersonating German personnel. The record of exactly how the German garrison reacted internally is thinner than the British side, since surviving German documentation of Colditz security is comparatively sparse. But the fact that guard procedures changed is well attested by prisoners who lived through the aftermath. No German equivalent of this particular escape existed, for the straightforward reason that very few German prisoners were held in conditions remotely similar to Colditz, and the flow of escape attempts in the war ran overwhelmingly in one direction. Where the comparison is more useful is with other Allied escape techniques of the period. American prisoners, most of whom entered German captivity later in the war and in smaller numbers relative to the British and Commonwealth POW population, produced no comparable case of a uniformed walkout from a major fortress camp. The most celebrated American-associated escapes of the era, including the mass breakout from Stalag Luft III, immortalized as the Great Escape, relied instead on tunneling on an industrial scale, moving soil in bags concealed under trouser legs and lighting 3 separate shafts with pilfered electrical wiring. That operation produced a far larger number of escapers in a single night. 76 men through the tunnel, codenamed Harry, in March 1944, but the overwhelming majority were recaptured and 50 were subsequently murdered on Hitler's direct order, a grim illustration that scale of ambition did not guarantee survival. Neve's method, by contrast, depended on precision and a party small enough to bluff convincingly rather than sheer volume, and both members of his pair made it to neutral territory alive. The wooden vaulting horse escape from the same camp in 1943, in which 3 men tunneled from beneath a gymnastics horse positioned daily by the perimeter fence, shared with Neve's plan a similar reliance on hiding activity in plain sight rather than brute concealment, suggesting that the most successful British escapes of the war tended to trust psychology and misdirection over engineering alone. The material impact of Neve's escape on the German war effort was, by any honest measure, modest. One escaped officer did not shift the balance of the war, and Colditz continued to hold hundreds of prisoners for another 3 years. Its real significance lay elsewhere. Neve returned to Britain with detailed current intelligence on Colditz's internal security, layout, and guard routines, information of direct use to the escape organization he then joined. Recruited into MI9's Room 900, he went on to help run underground escape lines through occupied France, networks that are credited with assisting roughly 7,000 Allied airmen and soldiers back to Britain over the remainder of the war, a legacy that dwarfs the significance of his own single escape. The psychological value to prisoners still held at Colditz was considerable and is well attested in post-war memoirs. Proof that the supposedly escape-proof castle could be beaten gave heart to men who had every reason to believe their war was already over. Whether it meaningfully altered German confidence in the camp system as a whole is harder to establish with certainty, and historians differ on how much weight to place on any single escape against the broader pattern of roughly 300 escape attempts recorded from Colditz across the war. The longer legacy of Neve's escape is bound up with the man himself rather than any single piece of hardware or technique. He went on, after the war, to a career that touched some of the 20th century's darker chapters. He read the indictments to the assembled Nazi leadership at the Nuremberg trials, a role given to him partly because he was a fluent German speaker and a decorated escaper who understood, better than almost anyone in the room, exactly what those men's regime had cost. He later became a barrister and a Conservative member of Parliament, and was assassinated by a car bomb at the House of Commons in 1979, a death claimed by the Irish National Liberation Army and entirely unconnected to his wartime record, but one that meant the story of the Colditz escape outlived him as a matter of public memory in Britain far longer than most wartime escape tales survive. What is not in dispute is that Neve's uniform, cobbled together from a Dutch greatcoat, melted silver paper, and painted linoleum, remains the single most cited example of Allied disguise-based escape from the Second World War, still displayed in replica form at the Colditz Museum that now occupies part of the castle, alongside the trapdoor and stage that once concealed his route out. Visitors today can stand in the same theater, look toward the same stage, and trace the route 2 men in badly stitched German uniforms once used to walk out of what their captors had promised the world was an inescapable fortress. It is 7:30 on the evening of January 5, 1942, and 2 men in badly stitched German uniforms are crossing a moat they have no legal right to cross, returning salutes they have no right to receive, walking with the unhurried confidence of men playing the single largest gamble of their lives. Behind them sits a castle built on rock, wrapped in wire, lit by searchlights, guarded by a garrison the German High Command genuinely believed could hold anyone. Ahead of them lies 400 miles of hostile territory and, if they are fortunate, a border into Switzerland. What got them there was not explosives, not brute force, not a tunnel driven through solid stone. It was cloth, dye, melted paper, painted linoleum, and the calculated, terrifying decision to become, however briefly, the very thing that was supposed to be guarding them. Colditz was meant to be the end of the road for men like Ari Neve. It was meant to prove that no amount of ingenuity could overcome enough stone, enough wire, enough searchlight. Instead, it proved the opposite, that the most secure fortress in the German prison system could be undone by a handful of men with needle and thread, patience, and the nerve to walk out through the front door dressed as their own captors. Neve did not blow a hole in the wall. He did not need to. He simply became, for the length of 100 meters in the freezing dark, exactly what the sentries expected to see, and they let him walk straight past. He was the first British officer to make it out of Colditz alive and free. He would not be the last man to try the same trick, though not every imitator would live to tell it. What he left behind in the memoirs, the MI9 reports, and the replica uniform now held in a museum built inside the very castle he escaped, is a simple, stubborn lesson about the limits of any fortress.